Hello, dear aspirants. Hopefully, you all will be fine and will be good in your health. So, our today's topic is economic challenges of Pakistan, understanding crisis, causes, and solutions. Pakistan faces a complex web of economic challenges that have persisted and evolved since its independence. These challenges impact every aspect of society from government functioning to the daily lives of citizens. This presentation examines Pakistan's economic landscape, exploring historical context, current difficulties, and potential pathways forward. By understanding the multi-dimensional nature of these issues, we can better comprehend the reforms necessary for sustainable development. We will analyze both domestic and external factors that have shaped Pakistan's economic trajectory, along with examining successful models for comprehensive economies that might offer valuable lessons. The state of Pakistan's economy, key indicators, and global positions. GDP 2023 is recorded as $376 billion, world's 24th largest economy by purchasing power parity. 29.2% inflation rate, one of the highest in Asia. 6.5% unemployment, official rate, actual rate estimated higher. 140th global ranking, Human Development Index position. Pakistan's economy represents a challenging picture within the global landscape. Despite having significant potential with its large population and strategic location, the country struggles with persistent macroeconomic instability. Credit rating agencies consistently place Pakistan in the high risks category, affecting borrowing costs. The World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index ranks Pakistan poorly on financial system development, innovation capability, and business dynamisms, highlighting structural weaknesses that impede economic progress. If we talk about historical context, we can say economic evolution since independence, 1947 to 1960s, post-independence agrarian economy with early industrialization efforts. Ayub Khan's decade saw 6% average growth and establishment of key institutions. 1970s nationalization under Bhutto, leading to decreased private investment. East Pakistan separation caused market loss and economic disruption. 1980s to 1990s gradual liberalization and privatization. First IMF program in 1988. Political instability hampered consistent economic policies. 2000s and present. Let's see brief growth period 2002 to 2007, followed by energy crisis, security challenges, and recurring balance of payment crisis. Pakistan's economic journey has been marked by periods of promise interrupted by recurring crises. The country has experienced several distinct economic philosophies from state-led development to market liberalization, yet has struggled to establish a sustainable growth model. The historical pattern reveals how political transitions often disrupted economic continuity, while dependency on external financial became increasingly entrenched. This historical context helps explain many of today's structural economic challenges. Current macroeconomic landscape, GDP, inflation, and unemployment. So here is a graph. You can watch it and understand it's all the readings. So here are some points where you can say in 2018, then 2019 GDP growth, 2020 inflation rate, and then unemployment rate. There are three colors almost similar, but you can understand it by viewing in detail. Okay, so Pakistan's recent macroeconomic performance. performance reveals concerning trends. GDP growth has been volatile, reaching a promising 6% in 2022 before collapsing to near zero growth in 2023. This boom bust cycle reflects structural weaknesses and policy inconsistency. Inflation has reached alarming levels, severely impacting purchasing power and disproportionately affecting lower income households. Food inflation has been particularly severe, creating social distress. Meanwhile, unemployment figures understate the problem, as they don't capture underemployment, and the quality of jobs in the informal sector. Fiscal deficit causes and consequences for long-term growth. Persistent structural deficit, 5 to 7% of GDP annual deficit, that is alarming. Then low revenue collection, tax to GDP ratio below 10%. It means only less than 10% uh, percent population of Pakistan give tax, or you can say under the tax net. Then high government expenditure, defense subsidies, interest payments. Then inefficient state owned enterprises, that's a major reason. Annual losses of 1.5% of GDP. Pakistan's fiscal deficit has remained stubbornly high, averaging between 5 to 7% of GDP over the past decade. This persistent GDP between gap between government revenue and expenditure creates a cascade of economic problems, including inflation, crowding out of private investment, and accumulation of public debt. The consequences of this fiscal imbalance are far reaching. High government borrowing drives up interest rates, making credit expensive for the private sector. Monetary financing of deficit fuels inflation, while the need for external financing increases vulnerability to external shocks and policy conditions from lenders. Pakistan's debt crisis, external and domestic debt burden. External debt, $130 billion in 2023. Multilateral institutions, IMF, World Bank, bilateral creditors, China, Saudi Arabia, commercial loans and bonds. Then domestic debt, 38 trillion PKR 2023. Government securities, bank borrowing, national savings schemes. Then debt servicing, 40% of government revenue. Interest payments, principal repayments, rollover risks. Sustainability concerns, debt to GDP ratio 78%. Exchange rate vulnerability, then refinancing challenges, limited fiscal space. Pakistan's debt burden has reached alarming proportions, constraining economic policies, options, and development spending. External debt is particularly concerning due to its sensitivity to exchange rate fluctuations and the foreign currency required for repayments. Debt trap is self reinforcing. High debt servicing needs lead to more borrowing, creating a vicious circle that diverts resources away from the development priorities. This debt overhang discourages private investment and creates persistent uncertainty about economic stability. Taxation issues, narrow base, evasion, and reform needs. Narrow tax base, what it means less than 1% of population files income tax returns. Agriculture, 90% of GDP, contributes only 0.1% to tax revenue. Retail sector largely outside tax net despite being 18% of GDP. Weak enforcement, Federal Board of Revenue lacks technical capacity and autonomy. Tax evasion penalties rarely enforced. political interference in tax administration, common complex tax structure, multiple taxes at federal and provincial levels, numerous exemptions and special treatments, high compliance cost for businesses. Reform priorities: digitalization of tax system, harmonization of federal and provincial taxes, documentation of economy and a reduction of informality. Pakistan's tax system suffers from fundamental structural weaknesses that limit revenue collection and create economic distortions. The narrow tax base places a disproportionate burden on compliant sectors, particularly manufacturing and formal businesses, while large segments of economy remain undertaxed. The reliance on indirect taxes, over 60% of tax revenue, makes the system regressive, disproportionately effective, affecting lower income groups. Meanwhile, tax expenditures, exemptions, and concessions amount to approximately 2% of GDP, benefiting primarily powerful interest groups rather than addressing strategic economic objectives. Energy crisis, impact on industrial growth and exports, circular debt 2.3 trillion Pakistani rupees according to 2023 of accumulated power sector debt, causing cash flow issues throughout the energy supply chain. Industrial impact: manufacturing sector operates at 60 to 70% capacity due to energy shortages and high costs. Textile exports particularly affected by uncompetitive energy prices, high tariffs. Industrial electricity costs 50 to 60% higher than regional competitors. Cross subsidization and inefficiency pass through in tariff structure. Transition challenges: shifts to renewable energy hamper to grid limitation and capacity payments to thermal plants. Outdated transmission infrastructure causes 18% technical losses. Pakistan's energy crisis represents one of the most significant constraints on economic growth. The persistent shortfall between energy demanded and supply, coupled with inefficient distribution and high costs, create a substantial competitive disadvantage for Pakistani businesses in global markets. This crisis has deep structural roots in policy missteps, including expensive power purchase agreements with independent power producers, inefficient state-owned distribution companies, and widespread theft and non-payment. These factors have created a complex web of financial liabilities that continue to grow despite numerous attempted reforms. Balance of payments, trade deficits, and foreign exchange reserves. Here is the graph of you can watch here: exports, imports, trade deficit, remittance, and current account deficits. Now we will discuss it in detail. Pakistan's balance of payments position remains precarious with persistent trade deficits driving external financial needs. The country's export base is narrow, dominated by low value added textiles and agricultural products, while imports are essential items like fuel, machinery, and food that are difficult to reduce. Remittances from overseas Pakistanis have become a crucial lifeline, exceeding export earnings and helping offset the trade deficit. However, this dependence creates vulnerability to global economic conditions and labor market changes in key destination countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the UK. Foreign exchange reserves frequently fall to critical levels, covering just a few weeks of imports. triggering recurrent currency crises and necessitating emergency external financing from friendly countries or multilateral institutions, IMF or World Bank. Agriculture sector challenges, productivity, water and climate change. Low productivity. Wheat yield is 3.1 tons per hectare versus world average of 3.5. Cotton yield 25% below global average. Fragmented land holdings and outdated farming practices limit mechanization and economies of scale. Water scarcity, per capita water availability declined from 5 to 60 meter cubic meter in 1951 to below 1000 cubic meter today. Inefficient irrigation wastes 60% of water. Groundwater depletion at alarming rates in Punjab and Sindh. Climate vulnerability, eighth most climate vulnerable country globally. Increasing frequency of floods and droughts. Rising temperatures threatening crop viability in traditional growing regions. Value chain gaps, post harvest losses of 30 to 40% in fruits and vegetables. Limited processing industry and cold storage infrastructure. Weak farm to market linkages and exploitation by middlemen. Aadti. Agriculture remains vital to Pakistan's economy, contributing 22.9% to GDP and employing 37.4% of the labor force. However, the sector faces multi-dimensional challenges that threaten both food security and rural livelihoods. The feudal land ownership structure persists in parts of Sindh and southern Punjab, creating socio-economic barriers to modernization. Meanwhile, agricultural support policies, including subsidies and price supports, often benefit larger land owners while providing limited help to smallholder farmers who constitute the majority of the rural population. If we talk about industrial sector, there are deindustrialization and competitiveness issues. First one, premature deindustrialization. Manufacturing share declined from 21% of GDP in 2005 to 12% in 2023. Infrastructure constraints, unreliable energy, poor logistics, limited industrial zones. Low global integration, limited participation in global value chains and technology transfer. Policy environment, inconsistent industrial policies and implementation failures. Pakistan has experienced concerning trends of deindustrialization at a much earlier stage of development than typical economic trajectories would suggest. The manufacturing sector's declining share in the economy represents a significant barrier to job creation, productivity growth, and export expansion. Domestic industries face multiple challenges: high costs of doing business, limited access to credit, outdated technology, and weak quality infrastructure. Small and medium enterprises, which could be engines of innovation and employment, are particularly disadvantaged by bureaucratic hurdles, limited access to finance, and insufficient technical support. The automobile, pharmaceutical, and engineering sectors show potential but remain constrained by policy inconsistency and inadequate investment in research and development. Informal economy, size, impact, and formalization strategies. Pakistan's informal economy is estimated to constitute 30 to 35% of GDP, with some estimates placing it as high as 50%. This vast undocumented sector encompasses street vendors, small scale manufacturing, domestic work, and even substantial businesses operating outside formal registration. While the informal economy provides livelihoods for millions, particularly those with limited education and skills, it creates significant economic distortions. Workers lack social protection, businesses remain subscale and unproductive, and the government loses vital tax revenue. Informal businesses also faces constraints on growth, limited access to credit and vulnerability to exploitation. Okay. While the informal economy provides livelihood for millions, last paragraph left. Formalization strategies must balance regulatory simplification with intensive structures that make formality attractive rather than punitive. Digital technologies offer promising pathways to gradually integrate informal activities into the documented economy. Investment climate, barriers to foreign and domestic investment. Regulatory complexity, Pakistan ranks 108th on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. Business registration requires navigating multiple agencies, complies with regulations, costs businesses approximately 30% more time than regional averages. Weak contract enforcement, commercial dispute resolution takes an average of 107 days. Property Property rights enforcement is inconsistent and vulnerable to political influence. Intellectual property protection remains inadequate despite legislative improvements. Security concerns, perceived security risks inflate business costs through higher insurance premiums and security expenditures. Travel advisories from major investor countries limit business visits and expatriate placements. Macroeconomic instability. Currency volatility complicates business planning. High inflation and interest rates discourage long-term investments. Policy uncertainty during IMF program negotiations create additional risk premiums. Pakistan has struggled to attract and retain both foreign and domestic investment, with the investment to GDP ratio hovering around 15% compared to over 25% in faster growing Asian economies. This investment gap severely constrains economic growth potential and job creation. Foreign direct investment has remained concentrated in a few sectors: telecommunications, financial services, and energy, with limited technology transfer or integration with local supply chains. Meanwhile, domestic investors often prefer real estate or overseas investments to productive sectors, reflecting deeper structural issues in the investment ecosystem. Human capital development, education skills and labor market. Education system weaknesses. 5.9% out of school children globally are in Pakistan. Only 52% literacy rate. Significant gender, regional and income disparities in access and quality. Skillful mismatch. University graduates face 16.5% unemployment. Technical and vocational training coaches reaches only 2.5% of eligible youth. Curriculum disconnected from industry needs. Low productivity, labor productivity 25% of Asia Pacific average. Limited on job training and upskilling opportunities. Low adoption of technology and modern management practices. Female participation only 21% female labor force participation versus 68% male. Significant wage gaps and occupational segregation. Limited childcare and workplace flexibility. Pakistan's human capital development lags significant behind comparable countries, creating a fundamental constraint on economic transformation and growth. The country ranks 134th out of 157 countries on the World Bank's Human Capital Index (HCI), indicating that a child born in Pakistan today will be only 40% as productive as they could be with complete education and full health. The demographic dividend that could power economic growth with 64% of population under age 30 risks becoming a demographic burden without urgent investment in education, skills development and health systems. Current public expenditure on education 2.9% of GDP and health 1.2% of GDP falls well below the levels needed to address existing gaps. Governance and institutional challenges, corruption and economic management, institutional quality deficit. Pakistan ranks 140th out of 180 countries on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Regulatory agencies lack independence and technical capacity. Civil service recruitment and promotion often influenced by political considerations rather than merit. Economic decision making, policy discontinuity with each political transition undermines long-term planning. Economic ministries lack coordination mechanisms. Data quality issues hamper evidence-based policy making. Powerful interest groups capture policy processes for rent seeking. Rule of law weaknesses. Commercial courts backlogged with cases pending for years. Inconsistent application of regulations creates uncertainty. Property rights enforcement varies significantly by region and social status. Regulatory compliance often negotiated rather than standardized. Governance and institutional weaknesses lie at the heart of Pakistan's economic challenges, affecting virtually every aspect of economic activity. Corruption and rent-seeking behavior divert resources from productive uses, while weak rule of law creates uncertainty that discourages long-term investments. The quality of economic governance is further undermined by the politicization of economic decision making, with short-term political considerations often overriding sound economic management. This has led to policy reversals, delayed reforms, and inconsistent implementation that erode investor confidence and economic stability. IMF programs, history conditionalities and structural adjustments. Historical patterns. Pakistan has entered 23rd IMF program since 1958 but only completed a few. The recurring need for IMF assistance reflects persistent macroeconomic imbalances that have not been fundamentally addressed. Most programs were standby arrangements for immediate balance of payments. Sports through standard fund facilities aimed at deeper structural reforms have become more common in recent decades than key conditionalities. Fiscal consolidation through tax increases and spending cuts, monetary tightening to control inflation, exchange rate flexibility and devaluation, energy sector reforms and subsidy reduction, state-owned enterprises privatization, financial sector strengthening, implementation challenges. Pakistan has often secured IMF financing but struggled with full implementation of conditions. Political resistance to reforms, particularly those affecting powerful constituencies, has led to program suspensions or waivers. The social impact of adjustment measures, especially on vulnerable populations, has created public opposition and implementation difficulties for successive governments. The relationship between Pakistan and the IMF illustrates the country's chronic macroeconomic instabilities, and the challenges of implementing sustainable economic reforms. Critics argue that IMF programs have focused excessively on short-term stabilization at the expense of growth and poverty reduction, while supporters maintain that Pakistan has failed to use these programs as opportunities for necessary structural transformation. Regional comparison: Pakistan versus other South Asian economies. Uh, Here is you can watch their country GDP growth, per capita income, human development index, exports as percentage of GDP. Now we will compare it with Pakistan. So Pakistan 6% GDP growth, per capita income $1,568, human development index 0.544, it means 154th in the country, in the global world. 10.3% exports as 10.3% of GDP. India GDP grows 7.2, per capita 2389, human development index 0.63, 132, on the rank of 132, and exports as a percentage of GDP is 21.7%. Bangladesh GDP grows 7.1, per capita 2688, human development index 0.661, 129th in the world, and 15.3% exports as a percentage of GDP. Sri Lanka minus, it means 7.8 in minus, per capita $3815, human development index 0.782, it means 73rd in the world, and 19.5% exports as percentage of GDP. So Pakistan's economic reforms has increasingly diverged from its South Asian neighbors, particularly India and Bangladesh, which have achieved higher and more consistent growth rates. This regional comparison is especially revealing given the similar starting points, shared colonial history, and comparable institutional frameworks at independence. The divergence stems from several factors: lower investment rates in Pakistan, weaker export performance, greater political instability, and less effective economic governance. Bangladesh's export-led growth strategy, focused on labor-intensive manufacturing, offers particularly relevant lessons for Pakistan's development path. At the same time, Sri Lanka's recent economic crisis serves as a cautionary tale about the risks of unsustainable debt accumulation and macroeconomic mismanagement problems that Pakistan also faces. Now, policy reform agenda, short and long term solutions. These are very important. First of all, immediate stabilization, broaden tax base through documentation, rationalize energy subsidies, divest loss making SOEs, strengthen social protection. Then medium term reforms, digitalize tax administration, reform energy distribution companies, strengthen regulatory frameworks, develop domestic debt markets. Structural transformation, it includes export diversification strategy, modernize agricultural value chains, integrate with regional economies, invest in human capital developments, sustainable growth. They are develop renewable energy capacity, implement climate adaptation measures, build resilient infrastructure, foster innovation ecosystem. So Pakistan requires a comprehensive reform agenda that addresses both immediate macroeconomic imbalances and deeper structural challenges. The sequencing of reforms is crucial. Stabilizing measures must be implemented in ways that protect vulnerable populations and lay ground for sustainable growth. Successful reform implementation will require building broad-based political consensus that can survive electoral cycles. This means effectively communicating reform benefits designing measures that distribute costs and benefits equitably, and establishing institutional mechanisms to sustain reform momentum through political transition. Now, here are some case studies. Successful economic turnarounds from similar economies. First one is Vietnam transformed from one of the world's poorest countries to a manufacturing powerhouse through strategic export orientation and foreign investment attraction. Exports grew from $2 billion in 1990 to over 336 billion dollars in 2022, with diversified manufacturing base spanning textiles, electronics and machinery. Then Bangladesh leveraged labor intensive manufacturing to achieve consistent 6% plus growth rates. The government sector employs 4 million workers and accounts for 80% of export earnings. Maintained macroeconomic stability with manageable debt levels while investing in human development. Then Turkey, on third, that is also a very practical case study in front of us, overcame severe financial crisis in 2001 through banking sector reforms, fiscal discipline, and central bank independence, developed diverse industrial base with sophisticated exports in automobiles, machinery, and consumer goods, invested heavily in infrastructure and connectivity. These case studies demonstrate that economic transformation is possible even in challenging circumstances. Common success factors include policy consistency across political transitions, strategic integration into global value chains, and investment in both physical infrastructure and human capital development. Each country each country found its own comparative advantage. Bangladesh in labor intensive manufacturing, Vietnam in export processing and foreign direct investment attraction, and Turkey in industrial diversification and regional economic integration. Pakistan can draw valuable lessons from these experiences while adapting strategies to its own specific circumstances. Conclusion: path forward for sustainable economic development. So here we are on last slide where we will talk about conclusion, path forward for sustainable economic development. First one, paradigm shift needed, moving from consumption led growth to investment and export driven model, shifting from state patronage to market based competition, transitioning from debt financed development to domestic resource mobilization. Second one is inclusive growth focus, reducing regional disparities through targeted infrastructure investments, expanding social protection systems to support vulnerable populations during transition, creating quality employment opportunities for youth and women. Third one is political economy considerations, building reform coalitions across political spectrum, communicating long-term benefits to citizens, sequencing reforms to create early visible successes that build momentum. Fourth one is external partnerships, leveraging regional connectivity initiatives like under the SEO, under the South Asia SEO, many others regional and international organizations are opportunities to leverage regional connectivity initiatives, developing strategic economic partnerships, accessing climate finance and green growth opportunities. Pakistan stands at a critical economic crossroads. The current challenges are severe but not insurmountable. With strategic policy choices, consistent implementation, and industrial reforms, the country can break free from the cycle of boom and bust that has characterized its economic history. The path forward requires not just technical solutions, but transformational leadership and societal consensus on a new economic direction. By building its considerable assets, a large youth population, strategic location, natural resources, diaspora connections, Pakistan can unlock its economic potential and create a more prosperous and equitable future for its citizens. Thank you for watching. See you later. Allah.